Linda, you should get married. You can have any man in the world.
No, I couldn't have. You know, it always looks like there's a line at the front door, but really it's not. What is it? In the beginner's mind, there are many choices. In the Zen mind, there is only one. That's an old Zen koan.
Linda Ronstadt is always remembered as a defiant voice, not just because of her timeless music, but for her remarkable composure in a world of turmoil, rivalry, and scandal. While others rebelled with loud statements, she chose silence. When insulted, she walked away without looking back. And throughout the golden age of American rock, Linda Ronstadt stood as one of the very few women who held her ground, without compromise, without bowing her head. But behind that calm exterior, what lay there? A string of nameless wounds, moments of being diminished in the very place she called her artistic home, collaborators who turned their backs, creative partners who, in truth, only sought control, and male colleagues, no matter how famous, who revealed their arrogance, misogyny, or a coldness that bordered on cruelty. For more than 40 years, Linda Ronstadt never openly criticized anyone. But over time, private stories surfaced, not out of revenge, but to make one thing clear. In the world of music, some people may not have been enemies, but they hurt her deeply enough to make her want to walk away forever. Linda Ronstadt's career journey. Linda Ronstadt wasn't just a singer, she was a melodic rebellion. In a music industry where men wrote the songs, men produced the records, and men took home the awards, Linda dared to raise her voice her own way, not to be a feminist icon, not to become a trailblazing artist, but simply because she refused to be boxed in. From her earliest days in Los Angeles in the late 1960s, Linda was unlike anyone else. When record labels tried to mold her into a commercial country pop act, she pushed back. When asked why she didn't sing more masculine music, she replied, "I already do, and I do it better than them." She didn't ask for permission. She stepped onto the stage with brown hair, a steady gaze, and a voice that could shatter the spine of any man who had once mocked her in the studio. The 1970s saw Linda Ronstadt rise not only up the charts, but into a position of real artistic power. Albums like Heart Like a Wheel, Simple Dreams, and Living in the USA established her as the top female rock artist, with a voice that could shift from a tender whisper to a furious roar within the same track. She covered songs originally sung by men, but didn't just repeat them. She transformed them into her own stories. And just when she reached the peak of pop rock, Linda veered off, choosing to sing Broadway tunes, then American standards, then traditional Mexican boleros in her native tongue. Record executives panicked, critics scoffed, but she went ahead because she never let anyone define who she was. Albums like What's New, Canciones de mi Padre, and Frenesí weren't just musical projects, they were personal manifestos. That art has no gender, no borders, and does not bow to expectations. But freedom comes at a price: solitude. When a woman refuses to obey, the world doesn't just turn its back, it looks for ways to tear her down. In recording studios, on tour, in backstage corridors, Linda faced inflated egos, backhanded remarks, and covert manipulation disguised as advice. Some of it came from colleagues, some from former friends, and some from people the world adored, except her. And that's why Linda Ronstadt didn't just move through her career as an artist, but as a survivor. But no one survives without scars. Behind every recording, every tour, every bold detour on stage were fiery clashes, quiet betrayals, and wounds so deep she once thought, "If this is what the music world is like, maybe I should walk away." Not everyone sees the dark side of the spotlight, but Linda lived in it and remembers every face, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. Behind every strong woman's success are the blows she silently endured. And here are 7 names, 7 cuts she never spoke of. Until now. First, Don Henley. When speaking of Linda Ronstadt, one cannot overlook her role in discovering and uplifting a band that would later become legendary, the Eagles. In the early 1970s, Don Henley was merely a drummer and backup vocalist in Linda's backing band. They once shared stages, studios, and intimate artistic moments. But when the Eagles took flight, Henley changed, and that once close relationship collapsed in a bitter clash. Things began to fracture as the Eagles' career exploded. From a band that had once opened for Linda, they rose to dazzling stardom, and Henley, now surrounded by ego and spotlight, started showing a condescending attitude toward the very person who had given him his first real break. In 1975, backstage at the Universal Amphitheater, Henley casually made a cold remark that Linda should just stick to covers and let real songwriters handle the rest. It wasn't just a professional insult, it was a blatant dismissal of Linda's artistic path, one built on bold, genre-defying choices. Linda didn't argue. She stood up and walked out of the room, and within weeks, Don Henley's name was erased from the tour schedule entirely. Mutual friends began whispering about backhanded comments, about how Henley described Linda as too sweet for rock, too precious to truly grasp the wildness of live music. Linda never responded publicly, but in a private conversation she once called Henley a climber who lost his soul on the way up. That argument marked the beginning of a rift that would never heal. From someone who once stood beside her, Don Henley became the first symbol of what Linda Ronstadt despised most in the music world: arrogance dressed in the glitter of talent. Second, Jim Morrison. They met only once. But for Linda Ronstadt, it was an unforgettable memory, not because of awe, but because of the humiliation of being forced to stand at the crossroads between art and primal recklessness. In 1968, Linda was still a young singer trying to find her place in a testosterone-fueled rock scene. Jim Morrison, by then, was already a rebellious icon, the front man of the Doors, drowning in glory, hallucinations, and alcohol. They crossed paths at an after-show party where the air was thick with smoke and live music pulsed non-stop. In a moment of excitement, or drunkenness, Morrison suddenly pulled Linda on stage for an impromptu duet. It was unexpected, but not unusual in that wild era of rock musicians. But what began as a spontaneous moment quickly turned into a stain. Amid the chaotic music and flickering lights, Jim Morrison suddenly tried to kiss Linda on stage. Caught off guard, she turned her face just in time, and Morrison stumbled, crashing into the microphone and knocking over part of the equipment. The crowd thought it was some strange performance art, but for Linda, it was a violation that got applauded. No photographs were taken, no headlines printed the next day, but those in the scene whispered about it, and what came afterward was worse. In a few interviews, Morrison mockingly referred to Linda, calling her sweet but soulless, a comment she never forgot. Not because it hurt her pride, but because it came from the very man who had dragged her into a moment of public shame. Linda never spoke openly about Morrison in later years, but in private conversations, she described him as a broken genius, someone who poisoned everything around him. To her, he wasn't just a symbol of wild rock and roll. He embodied the abuse of male power in art, the way a young woman could be exploited, humiliated, and then dismissed as lacking personality. The incident lasted only a few minutes, but the wound endured a lifetime. And it was the first time Linda realized, in the world of rock music, the stage isn't always a place to sing. It can be the place you learn to stand tall in the face of celebrated humiliation. 3. Neil Young. If anyone ever thought Linda Ronstadt only cared about music and fame, they were wrong. She carried Mexican blood, raised among stories of justice, fairness, and exploited migrant labor in the American Southwest. For Linda, music was always a form of protest, not loud, but unwavering. And that's why she once placed her trust in Neil Young, an artist equally known for his defiant stance and political engagement. In 1976, Linda and Neil participated in a benefit concert supporting migrant farm workers. In theory, it was a stage for solidarity. In reality, it became a night of disillusionment. With her characteristic thoughtfulness, Linda suggested including a few traditional Mexican songs, pieces she considered tributes to her heritage and the laboring community the concert aimed to honor. But Neil Young dismissed the idea outright. He called them too commercial, not aligned with the spirit of protest, and took over the spotlight entirely, leaving no space for Linda's voice. The show ended in tears, not from the audience, but from Linda herself, quietly slipping away backstage while the lights were still on. Witnesses later recalled Neil telling a reporter, "Linda's not built for protest." That statement to Linda was more than an insult. It was a complete erasure of her past, her heritage, and the ideals she had always stood by. Worse still, in the years that followed, Neil Young would occasionally bring up her name in interviews, with a tone that hovered between praise and condescension. There was always a trace of mockery, that Linda Ronstadt had a beautiful voice, but not the backbone to truly engage in protest art. To Linda, Neil Young wasn't just a colleague with differing views. He became a symbol of a strange kind of hypocrisy in the artistic world, shouting for justice, yet stepping on others when they don't fit your definition of what protest should look like. After that night, Linda declined every invitation to appear with Neil Young, whether in the studio, on stage, or in any social cause. She once said in a very private circle, "I can forgive a bad artist, but I can't forgive someone who uses righteousness to diminish others." And from that moment on, they were no longer allies, no longer fellow artists, only the silence of a trust broken beyond repair. Fourth, Frank Zappa. Linda Ronstadt once believed that music could erase all boundaries, between genres, between genders, between opposing artistic philosophies. So when the opportunity arose to collaborate with Frank Zappa, one of the most eccentric minds in the avant-garde music scene, she didn't hesitate. She admired him, a man bold enough to break every rule, say what no one else dared, and create music so complex it left even critics scratching their heads. But Linda soon realized, sometimes genius can be so ruthless that it forgets basic humanity. Their encounter began at a radio show in Los Angeles in 1974. Linda expressed interest in singing one of Zappa's compositions, an experimental, challenging piece not made for the mainstream. Zappa seemed intrigued and agreed to a rehearsal session, but once they entered the studio, things quickly took a different turn. Linda suggested a few minor adjustments to the arrangement, only to make the melody more compatible with her voice. She wasn't asking to change the song, only to understand it and honor it in her own way. But Zappa shut her down completely. He criticized her voice as being too pure, too clean, and in front of the entire band, delivered a line Linda would never forget. This is what happens when you give real music to a pop singer. No one laughed. But the silence that followed was even crueler. Linda said nothing. She stood up, walked out of the session, no goodbyes, no second chances. She never spoke publicly about the incident. But years later, in a private conversation with a close colleague, Linda referred to Zappa as a genius, but too dictatorial to understand that music also needs kindness. What happened with Frank Zappa wasn't just an artistic disagreement. It was a lesson in boundaries, that no matter how talented you are, arrogance can rob you of the most meaningful collaborations. To Linda, Zappa represented a familiar type of man in the arts, one who sees women as outsiders, lacking the intellect to comprehend, the courage to innovate, and fit only to sing along, never to contribute. The end of their collaboration didn't come from creative failure. It came from an insult masquerading as art. And Linda, who never once traded her dignity for a song, walked away without ever looking back. Fifth, David Crosby. During the golden years, when Laurel Canyon was still the cradle of musical freedom, Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby were once inseparable names. They appeared together at concerts, shared studio time, and blended their voices like kindred spirits, not just in music, but in a shared belief that music was a way of life. To Linda, Crosby was one of the few male colleagues who truly understood and respected her. But like many things in the world of rock, that friendship began to fracture, not in a fiery explosion, but through a slow, persistent unraveling that eventually became irreparable. By the late 1970s, Crosby was spiraling, his ego swelling alongside an ongoing battle with drugs and inner instability. During a 1978 recording session, Linda requested a key change in the arrangement to better suit her vocal range. It was a routine part of the creative process. But Crosby, consumed by paranoia and an obsession with control, refused abruptly. Worse still, he raised his voice in the studio, dismissing her request as the petty demands of a diva. The argument didn't end when the session did. Sometime later, David Crosby told Rolling Stone something Linda would never forget. "She's a label creation, not a real artist." To Linda, that was a deep cut. Not from a rival, but from someone she had once called a friend. The insult didn't come from a stranger, but from someone who had stood beside her, sung alongside her, and once shared what seemed like the same ideals. After that interview, Linda cut all ties. She refused any further collaborations, and even asked her team not to mention Crosby's name in tour meetings. Not out of bitterness, but because she refused to sustain anything that came from someone who belittled the independence of a female artist. In her reflections, Linda rarely spoke of Crosby, but in rare private conversations, she referred to him as a cautionary tale. That talent can be swallowed whole when driven by drugs, power, and unchecked ego. And that, sometimes, former friends can leave scars deeper than any stranger ever could. 6. Elvis Costello. By the late 1970s, as punk and new wave began to dominate the American music scene, many artists from earlier generations became subtle targets of ridicule, and Linda Ronstadt was no exception. But no one expected the most blatant display of disrespect to come from a rising young star out of England. Elvis Costello. They met in 1979 at a music festival in Cleveland. Linda was preparing to perform a set blending country rock and ballads, the style that had defined her for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, Elvis Costello, a rising icon of punk-infused new wave, showed open indifference, even disdain, backstage. In front of reporters, Costello quipped, "Her set sounds like background music for a Sunday brunch." Linda didn't respond. She rarely engaged with cruelty. But that night, after her performance, she approached Costello directly. In a drunken state, he not only refused to apologize, but threw in another mocking remark before walking away, leaving a bitter chill in the backstage air. To Linda, this wasn't just a personal insult. It represented a creeping attitude in the younger music generation, a contempt for their predecessors, especially women, who were dismissed as too gentle, too soft, or too successful by outdated formulas. Elvis Costello didn't just attack her music, he dismissed the entire artistic journey she had built with heart and defiance. Years later, Linda commented briefly in a private conversation, "I never had a problem with young people. I had a problem with people who think tearing down the old is the only way to prove they're new." The incident with Elvis Costello didn't turn into an ongoing feud. They never collaborated, never stayed in touch, and rarely mentioned each other in the years that followed. But for Linda, it marked the first time she felt, viscerally, that not everyone who comes after is here to learn. Some come only to destroy, without caring what it is they're tearing down. And sometimes the coldest cruelty comes not from those who've looked you in the eye, but from those who believe they've already figured you out through a single cutting joke. 7. Paul Simon. On paper, Linda Ronstadt and Paul Simon seemed like the perfect pair for a duet. Two golden voices, two musical legends with deep artistic sensibilities and masterful ears. But sometimes expectations kill sincerity. And in this case, what should have been a fated collaboration became an experience Linda would always remember as a bitter disappointment. In 1982, Linda was invited to collaborate with Paul Simon on a new track for his upcoming album. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly. Paul was polite, composed, and clearly a musical genius. But after just a few rehearsals, Linda realized she wasn't a partner. She was an uninvited student in Simon's classroom. He constantly interrupted her mid-phrase, issuing suffocatingly detailed directions, down to the phrasing and breath control. None of Linda's suggestions were acknowledged. Every piece of input was either corrected or quietly dismissed. When she asked to keep a few lines the way she originally sang them, Simon smiled and said, "We just need to make it a little more right." But more right here didn't mean artistry. It meant total control. Linda was never afraid of constructive feedback, but in her entire career she had never felt so small and so disregarded in a creative space. She didn't get angry or argue. She simply withdrew from the project after a few days. The song was never completed. And afterward, she never mentioned Paul Simon in any interview. To close friends, Linda described the experience as a class I never signed up for, where no one really needed me to be there. There was no direct insult, no confrontation, but the way Simon behaved, polite, composed, yet quietly overbearing, was what hurt the most. In a career filled with shocks and scars, this was one of the rare lessons Linda absorbed in silence, that sometimes condescension isn't in what's said. It's in a look, a performative nod, or the act of turning an artist into a puppet in the recording booth. For Linda Ronstadt, the chapter with Paul Simon didn't end in anger, but with a vow, never to collaborate with anyone who doesn't value creative equality. Because in art, imbalance isn't measured by awards, but by how we honor the voice beside us. Linda Ronstadt never wrote a memoir, never stood before a camera to call anyone out, and throughout her career, she chose silence over retaliation. But that doesn't mean she didn't feel pain. No one stands tall for over 4 decades in a music world dominated by masculinity, prejudice, and inflated egos, without bearing scars. The men who hurt her, Henley, Morrison, Young, Zappa, Crosby, Costello, Simon, weren't obvious villains. Many of them were icons, geniuses, even friends once. But they, through careless words, condescending actions, and sometimes just a single arrogant furrow of the brow in a recording studio, left behind wounds in Linda that were quiet but unforgettable. And though she never publicly confronted them, she chose to respond in her own way, through resilience, through bold artistic turns, and by never losing herself. She didn't need to shout to prove her strength. She only needed to sing, and let that voice rise as a sound of independence, equality, and refusal to surrender. Maybe no one saw all the battles she fought. But when we look back at the legacy of Linda Ronstadt, a genre-defying career, extraordinary artistic heights, and a spirit that never faded, we understand that her silence was never weakness. It was the kind of strength that made the world stop and listen. And those scars, rather than being hidden, became part of her legacy. Not just the legacy of a singer, but of a woman who dared to exist on her own terms in a world that constantly tried to mold her into something else.